Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video, environmental science, and specifically going over abiotic and biotic factors. Let's get started on this next video. So in order for organisms to survive, they have to go through and interact with living and non-living things. But what is living and what is non-living? Most of the time it's obvious if something is living or not. Plants and animals are living, air and water is non-living. But what about examples like trees that are going through? They've fallen down and they've rotted. Well, that's what we're going to go through and discuss in our video today, the difference between biotic and abiotic factors here. So the first thing we're going to go through and start off with is biotic factors. Now, biotic factors are parts of the ecosystem that are living or used to be living. We have to remember what categories we have to go through and classify organisms for in order for them to be living. Remember, all things that are living have DNA, they respond to stimuli, they're all going to go through and reproduce. They're all going to go through and consume things to go through and use energy. They're all going to go through and grow, and they're all going to be made out of cells. So when we go through and look at our biotic factors, the organisms in the environments and ecosystems that we're going to go through and look at, they're all going to have these 6 characteristics in order to be living. And those are going to be things that we classify as biotic factors. Now, if we think about our example of a tree that's fallen down and is rotting on the forest floor, is it still considered a biotic factor even though it's no longer living? Well, in this particular instance, it's still considered a biotic factor because it was once living and now it goes through and contains other organisms that are going through and decomposing it and are also living. So biotic factors are a key component of ecosystems because remember, all organisms are not only going to interact with the non-living things in the environment, but they're also going to go through and consume and interact and use other organisms and use other living things for energy and allow for them to go through and survive. Now, if we look at abiotic factors are parts of an ecosystem that have never been living. So think about things maybe like sunlight, soil, maybe temperature, maybe we can think of water, or maybe we can go and think of minerals here. All of these abiotic factors have never been living. In the case of the soil there, we could make an argument that there's organisms in that soil that are living. But we want to think about all of those things, those geological formations and all those things that have never been living, but still make up an ecosystem. Now, these abiotic factors are important. Some abiotic factors are used and consumed by organisms. Remember, plants are going to require light to perform photosynthesis and produce those carbohydrates. All organisms are going to go through and take in that oxygen and use it to get energy from food. Now, a dead organism is considered a biotic factor. However, we can clarify that dead organisms are only considered biotic factors as long as their structural remains are cellular. So in the case of that rotting tree, well, as the cells of that tree go through and break down, it's no longer going to be considered a biotic factor once those cells are degraded. So once we see the tree into its main components that make it up, its atomic structure, like the oxygen, the water, the carbon, we now consider it an abiotic factor. Now, other abiotic factors such as temperature, wind, and pH may not be used or consumed by organisms, but it's still going to go through and have a major influence on those organisms' lives. So if we're going through and trying to categorize this, let's think about biotic factors and try to make categories that we're going to go through and see in our ecosystems. Biotic factors are going to consist of fungi, archaea, bacteria. They're going to consist of animals. Maybe they're going to consist of plants, and they're also going to consist of protozoas or protistas. So those biotic factors, remember, they are living, and they all consist of the 6 categories that are necessary for organisms to be considered living. Now, abiotic factors, what are those going to be? That's going to be things like air, soil, things like sunlight, things like temperature, things like water, and things like minerals. All of those things that are within an ecosystem and within environments that organisms still depend upon. We still depend upon sunlight, we still depend upon the temperature, the air, the soil, etc. in order for us to live and in order for other biotic factors and other organisms to live. Alright, so let's go through and look at a hypothetical scenario here. Let's go through, maybe we're going to throw in some trees in this environment. maybe some rocks and minerals, put some clouds up in the atmosphere here. Maybe we'll throw in some plants in the water here. And then maybe in that pond, as we go through and look at it, there's some lily pads with some frogs or toads here. We can see some fish. Let's go through and maybe throw in some aquatic life here. So we can throw in some seaweed or some sort of aquatic plants, depending upon what environment we're in. We'll kind of throw in a songbird there. And let's go through and remember our microscopic, our subset of our ecosystem here. Maybe we're looking at the bacteria within the water. Well, if we're going through and looking at this diagram here, what is going to be abiotic and what is biotic? Remember, all of those things that are not living, right? The clouds, the atmosphere, those are abiotic. If we look at the trees and the frogs, though, those are biotic. Maybe the weather, if we're looking at the weather here, the changes in the weather, that's an abiotic factor that's going to go through and influence that environment. And we can see the rocks that it's going through and maybe raining on those are also abiotic. But we can see the fish, the plants, and all the other organisms in that water are going to be biotic, but maybe the substrate of that pond and maybe the bacteria that we're going through and looking at, the substrate's going to be abiotic, but the bacteria within that pond are biotic. So remember, we're going through and we're trying to classify and look at things. We want to be able to decide, well, is it living or is it non-living? And what is its influence is on the environment? All right, so this is going to be a slightly short video, but we wanted to learn a few things. So did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you learn what a biotic factor is? Did you learn what an abiotic factor is? And did you learn the difference between the two? If I were to give you an environment or an ecosystem, can we identify the abiotic and the biotic factors? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.